Hey everybody, Nick here, and today I got a review for you of this little guy right here. This is the CRKT Inara. So first off, in the name of full disclosure, I want to thank CRKT for sending this guy along. I told him, as always, I'm going to talk about the good, the great, the bad, the ugly, might be a gem, might be junk, and I sent him my full disclaimer on my website, but nevertheless, they sent it along. We do have to assume this is the very best quality controlled one of these guys ever, and I'm doing my best not to let that affect the nature and quality of my review, but nonetheless, that's what's going on, so there you go, full disclosure. Next thing, size comparison. This is not a particularly large knife. If we put this guy up to the Ontario Rat No. 2 or the Spyderco Delica, what we can see here is that, yeah, not so freaking big. Here it is against the Spyderco PM2. Again, not a terribly large knife. Although in terms of usable blade length, we are actually slightly exceeding the Delica. We are behind the PM2. It is actually a very small knife in terms of the handle. That's one of the things we'll talk about later. I want to do a quick thickness comparison because that's one area where this knife is really outstanding. If we compare it to the PM2, yeah, it's way freaking less thick. Even compared to the Delica, this guy comes in actually markedly thinner. And so that's actually a cool thing, and it's something you want to keep an eye on. So there you go. Then finally, a quick note. This guy is a Richard Rodgers design. Richard Rodgers is actually one of the hotter custom makers right now. He does a lot of the CNC style custom work. He's a really cool knife designer, and a lot of his stuff is really in style, and so it's he's the same person who did the CRKT CEO. He's done a bunch of other stuff out there these days, but nonetheless, this is a Richard Rodgers design. So let's go ahead and jump into the good, the great, the bad, the ugly of this very interesting little knife right here. So the good side, to start with, one thing that I actually thought was going to be a problem, it turned out not to be. Anytime you see a very tall thumb stud like this, and this is a unidirectional, a one-sided thumb stud, and that makes sense because you have the cutout only on this side, right? But I was worried that was actually going to be a pain for sharpening, but it turns out that if you throw this guy, even if you're doing this on a stone of some variety, here, I'll take out this little ceramic dude right here from there's a Spyderco stone, you can actually pull this in such a way that you end up getting the whole blade without actually interacting with this little stud, so that turned out to be a non-issue, even though it was something that scared me at first, so I figured I'd mention it real quick there at the start. Next thing, the blade on this guy is actually reasonably nice. Not only it is a Wharncliffe style utility blade, which is a very nice, I am a big fan of a good Wharncliffe, and I think this is a good Wharncliffe, because you can do these kinds of draw cuts very easily. You can do, there are a lot of good uses for a good Wharncliffe style blade, but it also is using relatively thin stock. This is a much thinner blade than even, for instance, your Spyderco Delica, things like that. This is a thinner blade than your Spyderco Dragonfly. This will cut. And it is also coming down to a relatively thin grind, which I can definitely appreciate. This guy is not going to be what you're going to want to do for prying, but by God, does this thing cut when it's shot. And it is 8CR14 MOV, so that when it's sharp parts, that's always the trouble. But it is a very easy steel to sharpen back up after you've used it any. So that's a nice thing. The blade is very nice. Next thing, the action on this guy is good. We'll talk a little bit later about the one proviso to this, but it is a very, very strong deployment. This deploys very reliably. The moment you can get this guy open, it does open. And it's not anemic. It's got a very strong detent to it. And it is running on on bearings, but they actually have a Teflon surround around the bearings, which I'm going to be honest, I don't entirely understand from a knife making perspective. If somebody gets why that's a thing, you can check my disassembly video to figure out what I'm talking about there. This has a very, very nice action, though, and that's a beautiful thing. Then finally, on the, actually not quite finally, next thing, the price is $40. That's a pretty solid price right here. I mean, that's a price at which you got to be competitive, and I feel like it is. Given the strength of the design, this is actually going to be a nice option at $40. That's good. Next thing, this is super light and super small. If I put this guy on a scale here, we are coming in, I should actually measure the blade length for you so you can see we're coming in around 2.75 inches, and we're doing that with 1.8 ounces of knife. That's really freaking light. And it's super thin as well. And because of the way it's built, it disappears in the pocket. You have just this much of it hanging out of there. This is a super easy knife to carry. This is a throw it in your pocket and forget about it sort of knife. And that's a beautiful thing. So it is a super light, compact knife. And I love that very, very much. Then finally, I have to say, this is in the vein of, like, CRKT has had a couple of these knives, like the Pilar, whatever it is, a couple of others, where it's really not trying to do all that much. They're not doing anything particularly fancy here, but what they've set out to do, they've done very well. And this feels very much like that as well. It's like, okay, it's at the end of the day, it's just G10. It's a steel frame lock on the blade, but every part of it is done well enough that it's like, you know what? Yeah, that makes sense. And so to me, at least, that's great as well. This is, it's not trying to do too much. It is super light, or I'm sorry, that's all the good. It's not trying to do too much. It's super lightweight. It's $40 with a good action, a nice blade, and a tall thumb stud that actually is easy to use, but isn't a problem for sharpening. On the great side, this is a good design. Look, this is something, and I'll talk more about this later on, but this is something that CRKT tends to get better than a lot of the small micro brands. They tend to work with really good designers. And you know what? This is a good design because not only is it a solid knife for actually using, but it's actually an attractive one. And you get this area where you've got like the fuller that comes along the blade and then comes out onto the handle here. You get the same thing on the other side here. This is a knife that feels like somebody has actually spent a lot of time thinking about it from a design perspective, rather than a knife where somebody said, oh yeah, that's nice shape, chip it. And that is actually a major strength. This guy feels like somebody spent a bunch of time, and Richard Rodgers specifically, who was a heck of a somebody to be working on these, has spent a lot of time making sure that every part of this, including, you know, deploying the lock, or removing the lock bar, etc., all of that is super easy. Disengaging is what I mean to say there. Language is hard, folks. But anyways, all of these things are meant to be thought through, and indeed they have been. And so the fact that this is a very good design, at least to me, that is 100% what's great and what differentiates this from a lot of the other smaller knives at $40 coming out of other brands. The bad side, I will say, CRKT has this habit of over-branding. You can see here, CRKT, then on the clip again, CRKT, and then over here, Inara, Rodgers Design, IKBS, and then 7140, which I don't know what that means, but they didn't need to put it there anyways. They just need to calm it down a little bit. It's like, I know you guys have a printer. We're good. Thank you. You don't have to brag. No need to flex there, buddy. Next thing, I have to say, at least from my perspective, and this is taste very much, but it feels a little strange to me that the only variant of this available is this variant, where it's kind of blackout, stonewash on this side, black G10, blackened steel, black clip. To me, at least, I would have expected that they might go something a little bit more sort of a classy folder sort of approach. This feels like a very nice, what's classically considered a gentleman's folder. This feels like it would very nicely fit that bill, but it isn't really done that way here, and that seems a little strange. Next thing, this guy, sharpening-wise, was not great out of the box. Luckily, like I said, it's 8 CR14 MOV, so it sharpens up very easily, but it just wasn't, out of the box, the sharpness on this was not particularly good. And actually, speaking of the steel, 8 CR14 isn't a steel that's super impressive. A lot of the Chinese companies have exceeded that now, especially in the micro brand world, and this is an area where CRKT is a little bit behind the curve in terms of materials, so I'd like to see that may be upgraded in future runs. Next thing, this is going to be a little small for a lot of folks, I suspect. It's not a big knife. I mean, the overall grip length on this guy is coming in, 3.75 inches. And so for me, I can get a 4-finger grip, and especially if I choke up a little bit, I definitely can do that, but it's not necessarily ideal. And I have to say, as I'm gripping this guy, although you've got a fair amount of gription off the G10 here, there is really nothing on this design that keeps you from sliding up onto the blade, so you do have to be a little careful about that. And then finally on the bad side, and I went back and forth as to whether this was bad or ugly, but it's definitely a problem, and it's one I'd like to see them address. This detent is very strong. That's a good thing. At some level, it means that this knife will deploy very reliably, but the problem is if you have any pressure at all resting from your fingers, and by the way, your fingers, as you're flipping this guy, you're going to want to hold right here. You have any pressure at all on this lock bar, this guy is not going to want to deploy. And in fact, I found myself, as I was carrying this, you get used to it after a while, and that's why it moved from ugly to bad. But this guy definitely takes a lot of practice to be able to get to a point where you're not resting your finger there and you can deploy it reliably because if your finger's there, you're going to hit this thumb stud and it's just going to be like, nope, no, I'm not coming open. And so the detent is very strong, and it's very sensitive to lock bar pressure, and it's very easy to put pressure on the lock bar given how small this knife is. So at least to me, that's what's bad or ugly, depending probably on your own personal ergonomics, is that the detent is very strong when the lock bar has any tension on it, or pressure on it, that is. It's a little small. 8CR14 isn't a great steel. It wasn't super sharp from the factory. The tactical finishing feels a little weird here, and it is a little over-branded. Final conclusion, I think is a neat little knife, right? It's got a nice blade, a good action, a good price, easy to carry. It's pretty well implemented for what it is. And you know what? It's a really nice design. I love seeing good design at budget price points because, by God, that's how we get more people interested in good design. There is a lot more to a good knife than just a good price point and good materials, and this is a nice reminder that great design brings a lot to the table. Mind you, it's also a little overbranded. The finishing feels a little at odds with the spirit of the thing. The sharpening was underwhelming, as was the steel. The knife is a little small, and the dent is just a little too strong if you've got any kind of pressure on the lock bar here. But honestly, I think this knife it's very good. And in fact, it's a good demonstration of how CRKT, I think, can survive the current market condition. What I mean, that sounds very grave, but I think there is a very real danger. When you've got companies like Civivi, you've got companies like CJRB or Rake, Ruwaiki, whatever the heck, out there creating very, very nice knives for price points that are very, very low. One of the things that they often struggle with is bringing great design to the table. CRKT may not be delivering value, certainly in terms of materials, compared to some of these smaller Chinese micro brands, but they have designers that are like great. They have an amazing staff of really, really nice knife designers from around the world who put in these really nice designs. And so they can drop these knives that are at modest price points, not trying to compete on raw price, because when they race to the bottom, they lose. But they're trying to offer better and more interesting designs for an equivalent price point. Yeah, you might pay a small price in terms of materials, and they definitely need to make sure that things are coming out of their factories consistent and whatnot. But this is a really good example of a knife that, if this were less well designed, would actually be very uninteresting, but because of the strength of that design, ends up feeling like something you should definitely consider at the $40 range. I really do hope, though, more than perhaps anything else, that this is not the last iteration of this knife that we see. I would absolutely love to see a carbon fiber and polished steel version of this as a classy sort of folder. I'd love to see a high-end version of this, because I think it's a really cool design. The design itself is really great, so I hope this is the beginning and not the end of the Inara line. But the thing is, I suspect that even right now, as it stands, if you're loving the look, if you're loving the price, and you're willing to stomach a little bit of a learning curve, making sure you're not on here, then I think the Inara right here will be a very, very good luxury companion for you. Oh, sorry, Firefly reference. Anyways, hope this has been interesting to you, and have yourselves just an absolutely wonderful rest of your day. Bye now.